Alrighty, in this video we are going to make our playlist items appear on the screen. So we already have access to that data. That data is being parsed and loaded in by the server, and it is being sent to the client in the form of our source client stores playlist.js. So when we do our connect, we emit a playlist list, and then we receive the playlist list event and tie it into our state property, which also publishes our awesome operations. I do also, actually, looking at this code, I do think I missed the publish replay. So instead of publish here, we want to publish replay, and I'll publish replay on 1. And what that'll do is the first time somebody requests the state, they'll always get the last state so that they can perform their processing on it. And then after that, they'll start receiving the individual events. So with that all out of the way, let's go ahead and jump into our components playlist list component. Now, I want to start off by discussing the format that our playlist data is going to be in. So if we go ahead and open up our data playlist JSON, we will see our JSON, as is right here. I wonder if I can format this, format code, and here we go. So each individual item I call it what's called a source. So a source has a type, a URL, a thumb, a title, and a total time. And the type will be what service we're going to play from, be it YouTube, Vimeo, whatever additional player you want. Maybe even serve up static images for X amount of time, serve out a song from SoundCloud, serve a live stream. Go ahead and put the type in as a raw live streamer, something to that effect. And then we have our URL, which is really just the aspect of the video that's going to be used in combination with the type in order to locate that video. So in this case, the URL for a YouTube video will be the ID of that YouTube video. Then we have our thumbnail for displaying thumbnails, our title, and our total time, which is in seconds. So really straightforward data format. There's one additional thing, of course, that gets added onto that. If you recall, in our server modules playlist.js, if you recall, we do actually go out and add an ID to each one of our sources, independent of what was loaded from the playlist. And so that ID is going to be used in communication with the server and client to say something like, oh, this source is now playing, that source is now playing, and so on. Again, the reason why we don't use the source ID, the source URL parameter rather, is because we might be able to have, or we should be able to support the functionality of having two items coming from the same place, but this ID makes them unique. So with that in mind, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a component. And this component is going to represent each individual list item within the playlist. And so we make a component out of it because there is some additional functionality I want to deal with. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say const playlist item component, and it'll extend an element component. And I don't know what that's yelling at me about. Unexpected token. Oh, const. Whoops. Class. Aha. I'm sorry. That was bad. Yes, constant class. Well, they start with the same letters, so I can be forgiven for that, right? All right, so let's go ahead and do a constructor, and the constructor will take in a source. And then the first thing on our constructor is we are going to call the super constructor. Remember, the element constructor takes in a element type. In this case, an li, because we're going to be appending it to a ul. Then I'm going to specify this underscore source equals source. And then I'm going to build up the HTML. And the HTML is going to look a little funky. What we're going to need is, first of all, just to break up the construction of this HTML, I'm going to start off with creating the thumbnail element. So I'm going to say const moneyThumb equals, and then I'm going to create a div with a class of thumb-wrapper. And then inside of this, I'm going to append a money image component. And the image component will have a class of thumb and an attr source, or src rather, of source.thumb. So this is our thumbnail. We have a div thumb wrapper, and then inside of that we have the actual thumbnail, which is an image component, and his source is set to the source thumb. Now, the reason we do that is so we can have the thumb wrapper as the placeholder for where the image is, but then we can make the image bigger or smaller independent of the thumb wrapper if we wanted to. So that's the reason why I put a wrapper there. And then before I forget, let's go ahead and import jQuery. ESLint's already yelling at me for not having jQuery imported. So let's scroll up here to the top. And I always like to do my, my library imports as the top import. So we'll import money from jQuery. All right, so let's scroll down here. Now that we have jQuery imported, now let's go ahead and create our details. So I'm going to say const details equals money, and then I'll say, I'll break this out a little bit because this is going to be a fairly involved element. We're going to say div class equals details. And then I'm going to append on, and then I'm going to open up an array inside, and I'm going to create two inner spans, or two inner inline elements. One will have the span class equals title, which will have an attr title of source title, and he'll also have a text of source title. So we're adding the title attribute to this element, so when you hover over your mouse, you'll get a tooltip of that entire title. That's going to come into play later because we're going to use ellipses to break the titles up so it just appears as one line, even if the title is super long. The next thing we're going to add isn't actually going to work immediately without an additional library, but let's go ahead and see what we need first, and then we'll talk about the library that we need to import. So I'm going to do a time of text, and what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say moment, which we haven't imported yet, dot duration of source dot total time, comma seconds, dot format. Now, what's interesting about this, we need two things. We first need to import moment in the top of this file, and I'll do that before I forget. Let's scroll to the top of the file, and let's just import moment. So import moment from moment, our awesome date time handling library. Come on, here you go. All right, and we're doing something interesting here. So we're saying moment.duration, and the moment duration constructor is going to accept in a bunch of different values. You can go to the documentation and figure out what else it supports. But we're passing in two parameters here, two arguments here. And the first one is the total time, the amount of seconds, or in this case, the amount of seconds the video is. And then for the second parameter, we're telling moment duration what we passed in for the first parameter. So we're saying we're passing in seconds, so consider the total time as seconds instead of milliseconds or minutes or hours or whatever. And then we're invoking .format. Now, the thing about this .format call is it's not actually going to work yet. We have to install a plugin for Moment in order to use the format method on a duration object. So Moment has two primary objects you work with, the date time object, which is just a moment object, and also a duration object. And here we're creating a duration object, but we need to format it. Moment doesn't support that out of the box. We're going to make this code work with a plugin. But before we do that, let's go ahead and finish out our constructor. And of course, that's not how you spell details. So let's finish this off by saying this underscore money progress equals money, and then span class equals progress. And I really like using template strings, even if for this sort of code, even if we're not using anything templatey inside of it. And the reason is so that I can use either double or single quotes inside of that. And as you've seen throughout this course, I prefer double quotes. And if ESLint is yelling at you about that, just go ahead and turn off the quote rule, which we did in an earlier video. All right, so now we have all of our individual components built up. Let's go ahead and create our fill up our element. So this element dot append. And we're going to do one more wrapper here. Append div class equals inner. Dot append, and we'll pass in our thumb, our details, and this progress. So maybe we can break this out a little bit to make it a little bit more readable. So here, our actual element is going to have an inner element, and then that inner element is going to have our progress, our details, and our thumb appended onto it. So really straightforward. And that's it for our playlist item component. We will need to install the moment duration plugin. Let's do that now. Why not? And then after we install that, we'll go ahead and write the code that'll actually convert all of our sources into playlist item components. So let's install that plugin. I'm going to open up a new console window. And I'm simply going to do npm install moment-duration-format save. Now, what's interesting about this library is it's a plugin. So it's very similar to jQuery plugins. It'll actually go in and modify Monkey Patch itself onto the moment object. So, and other related objects. So how do we include the moment duration format plugin? Well, we could certainly include it right here at the top of this file as simply import moment duration format. We could do that. But the problem with moment duration format is it like I said, it leeches on the moment object. It actually modifies the moment object. And every place we need that moment duration format, I don't want to include it in the place that we're going to use it. I guess you could say you could do that, because then if you try to include it more than once, it won't be included, or won't be reran more than once, I don't believe. But I think a much better way to do that would be to include the moment duration format once in our application.js. So I'll delete that, and let's go ahead and open this up, and let's jump down into application.js, and then here all the way at the top, I'm going to, after jQuery, I'm going to include moment duration format. Now, let's actually take a look at the source code of moment duration format really quickly, because I think there'll be something interesting that might answer a few questions you might have about how we're doing this. So remember, you can always pop open your npm dependencies. It's all written in JavaScript. Most of it's not going to be minified. So we can go ahead and just open up our moment duration format. And what you're going to want to do when working with these libraries is you're going to want to check the package.json for the main. And the main is going to tell npm or node or webpack or whatever what file within this package is going to be included if you include this package. So we see it's including lib moment duration format.js. So let's open that up. And what's interesting here is the question we want to answer is whether or not this library requires moment or not. By require, I mean, will this library load in moment if moment hasn't been already loaded into our global scope? So let's scroll down and let's try to find where it's going to require in moment to see if it's compatible with common.js. And what we can see here is the code right here. So here we know that we don't need to include moment ourselves before we include moment duration format. The second we include moment duration format, if it can't find moment, or if we're in a common.js environment, which it checks right here by checking the type of require, then it requires moment in. So it is compatible with both Node and Webpack and any other loader, but it's also compatible in the web on an actual web page if you weren't using a package loader, because as you see immediately after, if moment wasn't found by requiring it in, it checks to see if root.moment is installed, and root would be the window object in the browser. So we see we don't have to do any special shimming with this to get this to work with Webpack. It's just going to magically work, and that's the behavior we're looking for. So anyway, so remember, install moment duration format, and then you're also going to, again, want to include it in your application.js, which we have up here at the top right after jQuery, but we're also going to want to include it one more place. Think where else we would want to include this. The answer is, all the way down here in our webpack.client.js, we are going to want to include it in our vendor modules. So right now, we're including jQuery, Lodash, Socket.io client, RxJS, and moment. Let's also include moment duration format in our vendor. Now remember, including it in the vendor isn't going to execute the script, but it is going to separate out these packages into our vendor.js. So just including it here won't result in moment duration format being installed. We still have to require it in our entry chunk in our application.js. But with that out of the way, let's go ahead and write our playlist list code. So take a look at the playlist item component first. It's a little complicated, but I found that these additional, this particular format gives us a very easy time styling in CSS. So that's why I kind of went with the, we have the inner, then inside the inner we have the details, which has the title and the time. And then we have our thumbnail as the first element in the inner, and then we have our progress as our last. But let's scroll up here to the top for our playlist, and let's go ahead and subscribe to our playlist state so that we can display playlist item components. But actually, what I want to do here is I actually want to do a few things at the top, because we're going to be creating some code that's going to rely on the presence of a handful of things that I want to instantiate and alias out here at the top of the method. So I'm going to say const money items equals this element. I don't want to type in this element every time I reference the UL of this component, so I'm just aliasing it out into this local variable. Then I'm going to say const items map equals object, and I'm going to use this to relate source IDs with playlist item components. So let's say a command comes in from the server saying remove item number, item with the ID of 10. Well, we need to map that to an internal component. So that's what we're going to use that for. So now let's go ahead and say this playlist.stateMoney.comp subscribe. Remember to use comp subscribe. This, and then we'll simply, I'm going to open up a parenthesis and I'm going to extract out our state using an object deconstruction there. Whoops, I actually want to do a filter on this. I only want to run this code if a list command comes in. So I'm going to say filter a for action goes into a.type equals list. And then I'm extracting the state out of that action. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to reset everything. A list command means that there's a new playlist. So I'm going to say items.empty, which will empty out our items. And then we can also say items map equals money, which is actually going to require us to change this from a const to a let. So let's go ahead and set items map to a let there. And then I'm simply going to say for let source in state dot, I think it's called list. Let's refresh my memory at least. You guys might already know this off the top of your head. Yep, it's list. So for let source in list, const comp equals new playlist item component passing in the source. And then I'm going to go ahead and say items map at source.id equals comp. Then I'm going to attach the comp to our list. So I'm going to say comp.attach to our list. Remember, the attach method, or items, sorry. I don't like those items. Let's rename that to list. Just renaming that real fast. And ESLint will notify us if we forgot to rename that elsewhere. I like list more than items. Anyway, so list empty, items map equals blank. Then we loop over all of the sources, create our new playlist item component, and then attach it to our map, and then attach it to our list. So remember, since playlist item components is an element component, it has that attach method. So let's go ahead and hit Control S, and the bundle is now valid. So let's come over here and refresh, and we see a bunch of stuff. Not quite the stuff we were expecting, but stuff nonetheless. So it looks like something is being null somewhere, which isn't what we want. So, whoops, it's going to be let source of state list, not in state list. And as you see, our playlist is now populated. So remember, we do let source of state list because we're looping over an array. The ES 2015 of syntax for the for loop is for arrays, in is for looping over objects. Anyway, now that we have that, I'll scroll through the code one more time for you guys, and then in the next video, we'll go ahead and start the preliminary styling of our playlist. All right, and we'll see you guys then.